Hollywood has seen its fair share of heartbreak, but few stories have shaken fans quite like this one. For years, Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban were the golden couple, two stars whose love seemed untouchable. They smiled on red carpets, whispered sweet words in interviews, and looked like the picture of perfection. But behind those dazzling smiles and hand-holding moments was a truth that almost no one saw coming. A truth Nicole Kidman kept buried, until now. After years of silence, the Oscar-winning actress has finally opened up, revealing the painful reality behind her marriage to country superstar Keith Urban. What she said has left fans speechless, and even those closest to her say they never expected her to go public with it. According to insiders, the tension didn't appear overnight. It built slowly beneath the surface. Moments of distance, long absences, and words left unspoken. Keith's struggles, fame, and the pressures of two global careers all collided behind closed doors, turning what once seemed like a fairy tale into something far more complicated. Now, Nicole's revelation is exposing a side of the relationship the cameras never captured, one filled with emotional exhaustion, quiet heartbreak, and the price of loving someone who lives for the spotlight. For the first time, Nicole Kidman is no longer protecting the illusion. She's telling her truth. And it's not what anyone expected. What really happened between Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban? Why did Hollywood's most admired couple fall apart? And what shocking confession did Nicole finally make after all these years? Stay with us, because the truth about Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban's marriage will change everything you thought you knew about love in Hollywood. When Nicole Kidman met Keith Urban, it felt like fate. Both were Australian. Both had built their lives under the blinding lights of fame, and both carried scars from the past. Nicole had survived the collapse of her marriage to Tom Cruise, a love that once defined Hollywood itself, and she was still searching for something real. Keith, meanwhile, was the rugged, guitar-strumming country star who'd battled his own demons, including addiction and heartbreak. They met in 2005 at an event honoring Australians in the entertainment industry. Nicole later said that when she first saw him, something clicked instantly, a quiet connection that felt like home. "I remember thinking," she once shared, "I didn't know love like that could still happen." Just a year later, in 2006, the two married in a romantic ceremony in Sydney. The media called it Australia's royal wedding. The photos told a perfect story. Keith serenading Nicole, her radiant smile, their hands intertwined like two souls finally at peace. For a while, it seemed real. They had found what everyone dreams of, a love that could heal. But Hollywood's most beautiful love stories rarely last forever. Behind the glamour, trouble began to brew almost immediately. Keith's struggles with substance abuse resurfaced just months after the wedding. He checked into rehab, and Nicole, instead of walking away, stood by him. She said later, "It was devastating. But I wanted to fight for him." Her loyalty won public admiration, but privately, it broke her. Nicole had built her life around fixing what fame had destroyed, first with Tom, now with Keith. She was once again carrying someone else's pain, hoping love could save them both. As Keith recovered, their bond deepened, but so did the cracks. His touring schedule kept him on the road for months. Nicole, filming around the world, often traveled alone. The distance between them grew quietly, like a slow tide pulling them apart. Insiders said Nicole longed for stability. Family dinners, quiet mornings, a life without constant cameras and airports. Keith, on the other hand, felt alive only on stage. Their worlds, once beautifully intertwined, began to drift. Nicole would attend award shows without him, her eyes still shining but somehow distant. She was the image of grace, never speaking a word against her husband. But behind closed doors, friends say, she was breaking down. She had given everything, her love, her patience, her trust, yet something inside her whispered that it wasn't enough. The emotional weight began to show in her performances. Critics noticed a rawness in her films. During those years, especially in Rabbit Hole and Lion, it was as if she was pouring, all her unspoken grief onto the screen. Then came the moment that changed everything. One night, after a particularly tense argument, Nicole reportedly told Keith something that silenced him. "I can't lose myself again." She had lived that story once before, in a marriage where her identity faded behind her husband's fame. She wasn't willing to repeat it. From that point on, the distance between them became undeniable. The smiles remained for the cameras, but the warmth was gone. They loved each other, but love alone wasn't enough. By the time whispers of separation began, both had already emotionally moved on. Nicole threw herself into her work, finding peace in her craft. Keith focused on his music, channeling his emotions into songs about heartbreak and redemption, and when the official split came, fans were stunned. There were no explosive headlines, no bitter statements, just quiet finality. For the world, it was another Hollywood breakup. But for Nicole, it was liberation. She had given love everything she had, twice. And this time, she chose herself. In later interviews, Nicole would speak carefully, never cruelly. But her words carried weight. Sometimes, the hardest part of love is realizing when it's time to stop saving someone and start saving yourself. That sentence said it all. The world saw Nicole Kidman as the graceful star who lost another marriage. But in truth, she had found something far more powerful: her freedom. After the divorce, the cameras captured what everyone expected: a calm, composed Nicole Kidman. She smiled at premieres, posed for magazine covers, and spoke of new beginnings. To the outside world, she looked radiant, untouched by heartbreak. But behind that graceful mask, something was shifting. For the first time in decades, Nicole was truly alone. No publicist controlling the narrative, no husband by her side. Just silence. And in that silence, she began to confront everything she had endured. Those who knew her best say she spent months in reflection. She didn't want revenge, and she didn't want sympathy. What she wanted, finally, it was truth. For years, Nicole had protected Keith Urban. During their marriage, she had defended him publicly through his relapses, his absences, and his unpredictable behavior. She covered for him in interviews, smiled through the tension, and kept their troubles hidden from fans who believed they were unbreakable. But now, with the marriage behind her, she was done pretending. Her first hint came during a quiet interview at a film festival. When asked how she balanced love and fame, Nicole paused for a long moment before saying softly, "When you love someone who's still fighting their own battles, sometimes your heart breaks in silence." Those words weren't directed at anyone by name, but everyone knew who she meant. In private conversations, Nicole reportedly confided that Keith's emotional distance and relapses had taken more from her than anyone realized. "I was always trying to save him," she admitted to a close friend. "But every time he fell, I fell too. And at some point, I realized I couldn't keep losing myself." It wasn't anger she felt. It was exhaustion. The years of caretaking, of being the steady one, of living with uncertainty had drained her completely. She had loved Keith deeply, but she had loved him from a place of hope, not peace, and that, she realized, was the difference. She began to speak more openly about emotional burnout, about women who lose themselves trying to hold broken relationships together. Fans began to read between the lines. This wasn't just a reflection, it was a confession. Nicole described how love in Hollywood is often built on illusion. "You start performing even in private," she said in one interview. "You tell yourself everything's fine because that's what the world expects from you." Behind the charm and chemistry, Nicole and Keith had been living separate emotional lives. She craved stillness, while he thrived on chaos, a touring schedule, endless travel, constant noise. They loved each other deeply, but they weren't living the same story. The breaking point came quietly, not with an explosive fight, but with emptiness. One morning, as she later described, she woke up and realized she didn't recognize her own life anymore. "I had everything the world says you should want: love, fame, success, and I felt completely lost." That's when she made the hardest decision of her life. She walked away. After the divorce, Nicole didn't attack Keith publicly. But her actions, her films, her interviews, her tone, told the truth she'd held for years. Her performances became more intimate, more vulnerable. In Big Little Lies, she played a woman trapped in an emotionally draining marriage, and fans couldn't help but notice how real it felt. When a journalist asked if the role hit close to home, she simply smiled and said, "Let's just say I understood her pain." For Keith, the divorce was a wake-up call. He admitted in later interviews that he had made mistakes and struggled to balance his demons with marriage. He even credited Nicole with saving his life more than once. But by the time he realized it, she had already moved on, emotionally and spiritually. Nicole's revelation wasn't about blame. It was about liberation. She had spent too many years living in silence, choosing peace over truth. Now she was choosing both. And when she finally spoke the words, "I don't regret loving him, but I regret losing myself," fans understood. Nicole Kidman wasn't. It was raw, heartbreaking, and deeply human. The headlines faded. The interviews stopped. For the first time in years, Nicole Kidman disappeared from the noise. No red carpets, no confessions, no tears for the cameras. Just stillness. Something she had longed for, but never truly had. Her friends say that during those first few months after the divorce, Nicole did something she hadn't done in years. She rested. She took long walks, spent time with her daughters, and stayed away from the spotlight that had defined her life. For once, she wasn't performing. She was simply being. And that's when the healing began. Nicole had spent her entire adult life in love stories that were watched by millions. First with Tom Cruise, then with Keith Urban. Both relationships were powerful, passionate, and painfully public. Now, at last, she was learning who she was without anyone else's shadow. It was terrifying, she once admitted. "I didn't know who I was without love. I had to rebuild myself from the inside out. That rebuilding wasn't glamorous. It meant therapy, journaling, and facing years of buried pain, not just from her marriages, but from decades of trying to be perfect in a world that punishes imperfection." Slowly, Nicole began to reconnect with the parts of herself she had lost. She returned to the stage, performing in London and Broadway theaters, falling back in love with the craft that had once set her free. She described acting not as an escape anymore, but as a mirror. Every role she took became a piece of her healing, a chance to say the things she'd never dared to say out loud. In 2016, she starred in Lion, a story about loss, love, and reunion. The film earned her another Oscar nomination, but for Nicole, it wasn't about awards. She said, "It reminded me what love looks like when it's unconditional, the kind that heals instead of breaks." Fans began to notice a change in her, a calmness, a softness that hadn't been there before. She no longer needed to prove her worth through a partner or through the spotlight. She had found it within herself, and that's when life, as it often does, surprised her. Nicole found new love, not the kind that burns fast and bright, but the kind that feels steady and kind. She kept it private, quiet, away from the cameras. This time, she wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was already whole. She also began to use her voice differently. Instead of protecting the image of others, she started protecting her own truth. In interviews, she spoke about the importance of emotional boundaries, of choosing peace over chaos, of walking away from anything that costs your self-worth. "People think healing means forgetting," she said in one candid conversation. "It doesn't. It means forgiving yourself for staying too long and learning that you deserve better." Her honesty resonated with millions, especially women who had loved deeply and lost themselves in the process. Nicole became more than an actress. She became a symbol of resilience. Professionally, her career soared again. She won Emmys for Big Little Lies and continued taking roles that reflected strong, flawed, complicated women like herself. Personally, she surrounded herself with family, with art, with quiet joy. Keith Urban, too, eventually found his own form of peace, focusing on sobriety and music. Time softened the pain between them. Though they had gone their separate ways, there was no bitterness, only the quiet understanding that sometimes love's greatest act is letting go. When asked years later if she regretted her marriage to Keith, Nicole smiled and said, "No, every love teaches you something. That one taught me how to love myself." Those words summed up everything she had been through. Nicole Kidman had walked through fire, through fame, heartbreak and loss, and she had emerged not bitter, but wiser, stronger, softer. She no longer needed to expose Keith Urban. The truth had already spoken for itself. Her strength was not in what she revealed, but in what she overcame. And as she once said, looking back on her journey, "I used to think love was about holding on. Now I know it's about knowing when to let go, and still wishing them peace." Years passed. The headlines that once screamed Nicole Kidman's name faded into memory. Hollywood had moved on, but Nicole had found something far more valuable than fame. She had found peace. For a long time, she refused to talk about Keith Urban or the end of their marriage. Not because she was hiding, but because she was healing. She believed that silence sometimes is the loudest form of dignity. But when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of every heartbreak, every lesson, and every ounce of wisdom she had earned. In an interview years later, Nicole was asked what love had taught her. She paused for a long moment before answering. "That love isn't always forever," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's there to teach you what forever really means." It was the kind of statement that only someone who had lived through the fire could make. Honest, graceful, and unflinchingly real. She didn't blame Keith. In fact, she spoke of him with gratitude. She acknowledged that he had been a part of a chapter that shaped her. "I'll always care about him," she said. "But I had to learn that caring doesn't mean staying." Those few words struck a chord with millions. Nicole wasn't bitter. She wasn't vengeful. She had simply accepted that love can be both beautiful and painful, and that both truths can exist at once. She also revealed something more intimate, how she used to measure her worth by how well she could hold someone together. "I used to think being strong meant holding everything in place even when it was falling apart," she confessed. "Now I know strength is being brave enough to walk away when your heart knows it's time." It was the quiet honesty of a woman who had lived through the world's gaze and survived it. The public began to see Nicole differently after that. She wasn't just a movie star or an award-winning actress. She had become a storyteller of truth, not just on screen, but in life. Her vulnerability made her human again in a world that often demands perfection. Her films began to mirror that new self-awareness. In every role, from Big Little Lies to The Undoing, Nicole's characters reflected pieces of her soul. The pain, the strength, the endurance, it was all there, written in her eyes. But what made her story powerful wasn't just the heartbreak, it was the healing that came after. Nicole began speaking publicly about emotional resilience, about the importance of self-worth and boundaries. She became an advocate for women rebuilding their lives after broken relationships. "Don't be afraid to start over," she once said in an emotional speech. "Sometimes the second chapter is the one that finally tells your truth." Those words weren't just advice, they were the essence of her journey. As for Keith Urban, Nicole never denied his talent or his humanity. She wished him well, acknowledging that both of them had changed. "We were two people doing our best," she said. "But sometimes love isn't enough when you're both trying to find yourselves." And that's what her final revelation truly meant. That love doesn't always have to end in anger. Sometimes it ends in understanding. When a journalist asked if she believed in love after everything she'd been through, Nicole smiled softly and said, "Of course I do. But now I love differently. I love myself first." That perhaps was the truest exposure of all, not about Keith Urban, but about Nicole Kidman herself. A woman who once lived in the shadows of others' fame, now standing fully in her own light. Her story wasn't about destruction, it was about rebirth. She didn't expose Keith to hurt him. She exposed her own truth to free herself. And as she looked back on her life, She summed it up with one line that fans around the world would never forget. "The greatest love story I ever lived was learning to love myself again." In the end, that's the truth Nicole Kidman left behind. Not a scandal, not a secret, but a reminder that even after heartbreak, beauty still lives in the courage to begin again.